Seeking the lost, yes, kindly entreating, wanderers on the mountains astray. Come unto me, his message repeating, words of the Master speaking today. Going afar upon the mountain, bringing the wonder back again into the fold of my Redeemer, Jesus the Lamb for sinners slain. Seeking the lost and pointing to Jesus, souls that are weak and hearts that are sore, leading them forth in ways of salvation, showing the path to life evermore. Going afar upon the mountain, bringing the wonder back again into the fold of my Redeemer, Jesus the Lamb for sinners slain. Thus I would go on missions of mercy, following Christ from day unto day, cheering the fainting, raising the fallen, pointing the lost to Jesus the way. Going afar upon the mountain, bringing the wonder back again into the fold of my Redeemer, Jesus the Lamb for sinners slain.
How many did you want for?
Let's do one more. Do we have what was the first one? I'd cross it out first. I need the area. Jordan and I were listening to this morning. I need thee every hour, most gracious Lord. No tender voice like thine can peace afford. I need thee, oh, I need thee every hour.
I put just a few items up here on the table in case you would like to just look at these, and you can the handouts here you can have there. That's the material that I taught in the Bible class during the breakout sessions. I think that today the breakout session is going to deal with the Back to the Bible series. You have this one as well? Does this look familiar? Okay. Well, this is, just looking ahead, this is a combination of those three lessons. It's a scaled down version of Back to the Bible. It's by the same people. It's a one-shot lesson. It's a one-shot lesson. So, and this is a book by Phil Sanders. It's a really good resource, and I would recommend anybody, every Christian, to have this particular book. It's a great book, and you can get this. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Muscle and Shovel. It's been a very effective tool. It's a good book, a good read, and I think I would recommend it. Now, this is a book by someone who's not a member of the church, but this is a great book. Greg Kalkle is a world-class apologist. This book is, I'm going to borrow heavy from this book in this session with regard to some things, and it teaches us some very important lessons and some things I want us to think about today that'll be important to us as we think about the process, the tactics of being evangelistic. And he opens some of the thoughts. Well, it's on about page 56, I think, when he makes the statement. But the thing that he said is, he says, our topic is, where do I start? If we're going to be evangelists, where do we start? And one of the things I think we need to understand is, everywhere we are, we can be evangelistic. No matter where we are, we can be evangelistic. But if you recall, in the very first session on Thursday night, and for those of you that may not have been here, we made the point that being evangelistic is not some cookie cutter picture of that everybody follows. In other words, evangelism takes entails a wide variety of activities and things of that nature. But Kalkle made this statement, and I think it's helpful, is that our tactics in our evangelistic efforts should, and he says, this is his quote, should look more like diplomacy than D-Day. More like diplomacy than D-Day. And with that in mind, and I think it's important, is we live in an increasingly loud culture, and that everything that we see is just basically just shouting back and forth. It's not allowing people to speak before we interrupt them. And I say we, I mean just as in general. I mean, if you watch, and I don't anymore, I quit watching sports talk television about 8 years ago. It just got to where it was just so unbelievably crude, and people didn't treat one another very well, and it just wasn't conducive for me mentally. It was just a beating, and so I got away from that in about 2014, and I think my life's a lot better because of it. But it doesn't have to be sports talk. It can be political talk. I mean, you can watch any political talk show. Even people who are in agreement don't treat each other very well a lot of the times. And so we want to, we don't want to. We want to be more diplomatic in our approach than to be bombastic. Nikki Haley, who was at one time, I believe, the governor of South Carolina, and she was the ambassador to the UN, made this statement in a political context, but I think it certainly applies to what we're trying to accomplish. And she says, we need to stop trying to own liberals and start trying to convince them. Now, if you ever spend any time on YouTube, or you see, there's Instagram or these reels that come up, how many times do you see this headline opens up with these three words: Ben Shapiro, all caps, what? Owns or wrecks or destroys. Destroys is probably the one you see more than, Ben Shapiro owns, wrecks, destroys, obliterates, or Jordan Peterson obliterates. By the way, I'm a huge Jordan Peterson guy. Man, I love that guy. I really do. I knew Jordan Peterson believed in God before Jordan Peterson knew that he believed in God. You could hear him, and you knew. I talked to my best friend. I said, "That dude believes in God. He just doesn't know it yet." And then he comes out a couple years ago, and he just openly professes faith in God, and he's done some really incredible lectures on the Bible. He's not a Bible scholar, but he's extremely insightful, and I would recommend about anything you can hear him say. And I will warn you, if you watch any of his older videos and some of his newer ones, he's pretty loose with his language. And so I'm just giving you fair warning. But the guy's got a lot of good things to say. But the whole thing is Jordan Peterson never tries to own anybody. He never tries to destroy anybody. It's always about, he's like, why would you say that? Here are the facts. What you're saying is not true, and here's why it's not true. He's always trying to convince the person that he's talking to, and that's the one thing I love about his presentation. And as Christians, we need to think about that. What we're trying to do is we're trying to convince people to obey the gospel. To accept what the teaching of the Bible is. Another great, and let me just throw this out real quick. I know that YouTube and that type of online activity, it's kind of a male-dominated, about 75 or 80% of YouTube users or regular viewers are male, all right? But ladies, there's some really good material out there in the area of apologetics, and I would say to all of you, watch clips of William Lane Craig. Watch clips of William Lane Craig. Watch clips of Ravi Zacharias. Watch clips of Greg Kalkle. Watch clips of Frank Turek. I mean, there's some really good guys out there that are working in the realm of apologetics. And the reason I mention those guys specifically is, as I mentioned yesterday, your generation is not one that holds a whole lot of faith in God in general. And so, remember I told you, you have a lot of advantages over my generation, but you also have some disadvantages. And one of those big disadvantages is a lot of your generation does not believe in God. And so you don't get to start here. Okay? When you're talking to somebody who does not believe in God, you don't get to start here. You've got to start somewhere else. One of my best friends is a missionary in Singapore at the School of Preaching there, and he told me he'd been to Russia a time or two, and he was on a missionary trip into Russia. I think he may have been in Murmansk, and they were on and he just stumbled across some guy, and he struck up a conversation with this guy who knew look, if you're in Murmansk and you're an American, you're probably some kind of missionary. I mean, people just don't go there for I see Avery, he's nodding and said, you don't go there for vacation, all right? Because that place stinks. All right, the weather's just horrible, all right? So Jamie's engaged, this guy really engages Jamie in a conversation. And the first thing Jamie does is he pulls his Bible out, and here's the first words out of that guy's mouth. So you got a book. All right, so what does that mean? Jamie can't start here. All right, and the same thing goes for the generation from about 30 and down. So you got a book. Why should I believe this book? And so you got your work cut out for you. And so that's why I want you to think about watching some of these short 3, 5, 10, 15-minute clips of these great apologists, because they're going to help you. They're going to help you in that respect, and they're going to help you learn how to think and how to respond to people properly when you're engaged in that type of dialogue. I was listening to Kalkle, by the way, on the Babylon Bee podcast, and big fan of the Bee. And on this, he's been on twice. And by the way, I would recommend you listen to both of his sessions on if you can get through the foolishness in the first 20 minutes when they finally introduce their guest, and it's Kalkle, then it gets really good. But Calkel he says, we must be concerned with gardening before harvest. We must be concerned, nobody harvests fruit without gardening first. And anybody that knows me knows that I'm a gardener. I love to garden. I've got big garden, and there's a lot of work that goes in before you get to eat those tomatoes. There's a lot of work that goes in before you get to eat corn or peas or whatever it is that you're growing in that garden. And so what we need to understand is a lot of times it takes a lot of gardening before there's a harvest. And so you think about what Jesus said, in John 4, 34 to 38, he said, I'm going to send you to reap where you have not sown. So you're going to reap where you have not sown. Now I want you to think about what that means. It means that Jesus said, you're going to go out and you're going to preach to people. And they're going to obey, but really somebody else has done all the legwork ahead of you. Right? I had this very situation in Ghana a few years ago. We went and we did personal evangelism, a big campaign of personal evangelism for about 4 or 5 days, and we baptized a ton of people. But it didn't really have anything to do with us. What had happened is that all the local preachers had been out knocking doors, making contacts. When we got there, we already had the appointments set up. All we did was came in and harvested, but somebody else had been doing the gardening. Somebody else had put in all the legwork. They'd done all the work ahead of time, and we just came in and reaped the harvest. Right? But when you think about that, we need to think that Jesus said, I'm going to send you to reap where you have not sown. I say that because what you have to understand is just because you do not reap doesn't mean that you've not done a great deal of good. I always used to think when I first started preaching full time that if I didn't baptize somebody the very first time I sat down with them, I was a failure. This is a true story. I'm not proud of it, all right? I know for a fact that I baptized, when I was working in Paris, Tennessee, I was one of the ministers at East Wood Street. I know for a fact that one couple went to the church building with me because I'd been to their house. They'd visited the services. I followed up on their visit. I was having a Bible study with them that night. I know for a fact they went to the church building and let me baptize them just so I would leave. Just so I would leave, because I was so intent on wanting them to obey the gospel. And you know how I know that? Because we never saw them again. This is a small town. It's a town of 10,000 people. All right? So, it's not like you live here and you can see somebody and not see them again for years. All right? We never saw them again. I made every effort I could to go to their house. They moved. I went to their new apartment, everywhere. Never saw them again. Right. Did those people obey the gospel? They don't obey the gospel. They wanted an overzealous 20-something-year-old minister to get out of their house so that they could do whatever, watch Johnny Carson and go to bed. All right? And so what I want you to understand is that just because you don't baptize somebody when you first start talking to them, don't think that you have in any way failed. Now I want you to think about this. Did Jesus ever reap where he had not sown? Have you ever considered that? Jesus told the apostles, I'm going to send you out and you are going to reap where you have not sown. Okay, let me ask you a question. Who had done the sowing where the apostles were going to reap? The Lord. Right. Now, did the Lord ever reap where he had not sown? Yes or no? I see the wheels turning. You think this is a trick question? And the answer is the question is, did the Lord ever reap where he did not sow? And you want to say no, right? You want to say no, but you know that the answer is yes, or I wouldn't be following this line of questioning. Have you ever heard of a guy named John the Baptist? You ever heard of that guy? All right, so we're all familiar with John the Baptist. Okay. What did John the Baptist say was his job? To do what? Prepare the way for who? The one who would come after him is who? Jesus. My job is to prepare the way for the one who's to come after me. I'm going to straighten the curves. I'm going to flatten the hills. I am a forerunner. So when Jesus started talking to people about baptism, was that the first time that most of them had ever heard anything about baptism? Had somebody been baptizing before Jesus got started baptizing? Well, who was it? Who was it? It was John. Now, do you reckon that there were a lot of people that were baptized in the ministry of Jesus and after who'd actually been taught by John, but they hadn't obeyed it when John taught it? So did John fail when those people? No. So we need to understand that a lot of times we need to think about there's a lot of gardening that has to take place before there's reaping, before there's a harvest. All right, now where do I start? Now this is from Calkel's book. He talks about three things. We're supposed to have a 15-minute break between me and Avery, right? All right. I'm not opposed to singing, but you sang about 13 minutes of my time, dude. So, okay. All right. Here's the thing about Calkel, and this is if you don't take anything away from his book, and what I'm telling you about this is worth it. He says, you're never going to convince everybody in a single encounter or in a first encounter. He says, what I try to do is I try to put a rock in their shoe. I try to put a rock in their shoe. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? I try to put a rock in their shoe. You try to put something in their mind that they can't get out, right? Like if there was a small pebble in these boots that I'm wearing, how often am I going to be reminded that there's a pebble in my boot? Every step, every time I take a step, there's that rock. There's that rock in my shoe. Of course, with your shoes, you can do what? You can take your shoe off and you can dump out the pebble. But when you've got a rock in your shoe in your head, you don't just get to lean your head over and knock it on the side and the pebble goes out. You can't get away from it. And that's what Calkel's book really starts with, is putting a rock in people's shoe. All right, give them something to think about that they can't stop thinking about. You're not going to reap the harvest, but you may be the one that plants the seed in the mind of that individual that somebody else gets to come along later and reap the harvest. What did Paul say in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6? He said, I planted what? Apollos watered, and God gave the increase. So in other words, there were some people who heard Paul, and then Apollos came along and he watered the seed that Paul had planted, and then sometime later, what? Those people became Christians. Is that a pretty fair assessment of how we might understand that verse? So did Paul fail? Nope. Did Apollos fail? Nope. But somebody else came along and reaped where those men had sown and watered. So we want to be mindful of everywhere we go, we have an opportunity to put a rock in somebody's shoe. Now, let me just give you the opening account in Calkel's book that really illustrates this and how we can do this. And the main thing is we want to ask questions. We want to ask questions. We want to engage the individual and engage them in their mind. So here's Calco. He and his wife are on vacation somewhere, and they're in a little store, and they're going through the checkout, and there's a girl who's she's the clerk or the cashier, and she's wearing a pentagram. You know what a pentagram is? It's an upside down, it's a 5-sided star upside down inside of a circle where the point is down and it's inside a circle. All right? Now, as a general rule, pentagrams are associated with the occult. The occult. Now, when I was in high school in the 80s, you could find pentagrams everywhere because we were all metalheads and you know, you could find a pentagram on just about all of my notebooks. Because I was a hard rock guy, right? But I was not interested in the occult. It was just something, right? Just something associated with being a hairband guy, you know, or some hard rock guy, you know. But you could find pentagrams. You can go back and look at my old school books. There's pentagrams on them, all right? I'm not interested in the occult. Never have been, all right? Never have been. So Calco asked this girl. He said, I noticed this piece that you're wearing. He says, is it just jewelry or does it mean something? See, it's a very simple question, right? I mean, it's like he could have looked at my notebook and said, hey, look, I noticed you got a pentagram on your notebook. You know, you think it's just cool or does it mean something to you? Just something simple. And she says, well, it has meaning. She said, and here's her words. She goes, I'm a pagan. All right, now, pagans is a word that they use that they use it in a sense that we don't use it. All right? And Calco said his wife cackled. She laughed until she realized that this girl was serious. All right? And she goes, I'm a pagan. Well, obviously Calco knew that meant she was a Wiccan. You know what a Wiccan is? W-I-C-C-A-N, Wiccan. You know, what did we used to call Wiccans? Witches. All right? And again, people who use that terminology don't use it in the same sense that we traditionally think about it. So she says, okay, she goes, I'm a Wiccan. She says, you know, we believe in respecting all life. You know, because Wiccans are basically pantheists. You know, God, the world is God, nature is God, and God can be seen everywhere in nature. So she says, we have respect for all life. All right, so she set forth this premise that my faith system says I respect all life. And so Calco says, that's interesting. He said, so as one who respects all life, I'm going to make an assumption that you are pro-life. And she goes, oh, no, I'm pro-choice. He said, well, wait a minute. He said, you just told me that you respect all life, but now you tell me that you're pro-choice. And here's what she says. She says, I believe women should have a choice, but I could never kill a baby. So now what has she said? What's she said? Well, she's contradicted herself in one sense, but at the same time, she's also admitted that what abortion is, right? It's her words. Abortion is killing a baby. And so then he follows that up. He said, well, then as one who respects all life, don't you think it would be a worthy endeavor to try to protect all life? If you respect all life, shouldn't you try to protect all life? And she said, well, it just depends on the circumstances. And he said, okay, well, what would be the circumstance in which you would think, that killing and he used her terminology. He said, under what circumstance do you think it would be acceptable for a woman to kill a baby? And she said, well, incest. He says, okay. He said, well, let me ask you another question. And see, he's just asking very simple questions. He said, well, let me ask you a question. He said, if I were standing here before you and I had a 2-year-old child who was the result of incest, he said, would it be all right for me to kill this kid? And it's like, well, no. And also, so, but then, and here's what he said, because I noticed that there was a line starting to form behind me in the checkout counter, And so, I gathered up my stuff and we went on. But what had he done? He had just challenged her entire faith system using her own words that she had used to embrace that faith system. All right? Do you think she gave any more thought to that? You would hope that she did. And it's like Calkle said, he goes, I'll never see that girl again. The odds that I will never see her again. He said, but somebody down the road might have an opportunity to talk to her about the Lord because her faith system has been challenged and she understands there's some really bad inconsistencies in her way of thinking. That's putting a rock in someone's shoe. And so he refers to this as having first knowledge. First has to be knowledge. And he calls this the accurately informed mind. Knowledge, an accurately informed mind. Then what he practiced was called the artful method, wisdom. If you're going to break it down into three parts, it would be knowledge, wisdom, and character. Knowledge, wisdom, and character. Knowledge is the accurately informed mind. Wisdom is the artful method. In other words, there's a methodology that you use, all right? And then there is character, and that is an attractive manner. Calkle didn't try to own that girl at the cash register. So when I say character, I don't mean that the person knows the type of character that you possess. It means the character that you exhibit in your exchange. The girl didn't, think about it. Calkle could have owned her at the cash register, right? And he could have made her mad, right? And in the long run, he wouldn't have done any good, would he? So it was a matter of the character that he exhibited. He expressed a sincere interest in something that meant something to that girl. And then he expressed an interest in what that girl thought. And then he challenged her thinking in a very non-threatening way by simply asking a few questions. Now, these are things that we can do every single day. Not necessarily with random strangers, right? These are things that we can do every day with people at school, people at work, people that we might spend time with in other venues. Very simple. All right. Now I want to do this as well because I am going to run out of time on this.
We moved Avery back extra 15 minutes. Still got to sing. She got till 11.
Is that why Avery left? He went to go get a cup of coffee? Because hope he brings me back one. Not Starbucks. Some of you will get that, some of you. All right, think about this. In our artful method, within the artful method, three things. Actually four, but the third one goes together. Number one, in your artful method, listen carefully. Listen carefully. When you engage someone by asking them a question, listen to everything they say before you even begin to try to formulate a response. Right? Because if you let them make one statement and then your mind immediately goes to how you're going to respond to that statement, you've not heard anything that they've said after that. And when we do that, then we risk misrepresenting what they believe. And we never want to misrepresent anybody, ever. So listen carefully. James 1 and beginning in about verse 18, let every man be swift to do what? Hear, and slow to do what? Speak. And obviously slow to wrath. All right? Swift to hear slow to speak, slow to wrath. Here's another point that Calco makes in his book, which is also true. The moment somebody gets mad, it's over. The moment somebody gets angry, it's over. All right? So in the situation with the person he didn't know, he was extra cautious. All right? Now, am I telling you that when you do this, nobody's ever going to get angry? No, I'm not telling you that. But I'm also not telling you that just because they get angry that it's going to be over forever. It's just over then. It's just over right then. You can come back later. Okay? Swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Again, when somebody gets mad, if anger ensues, it's over. Everybody loses. I'll tell you this story. When I was in Arizona, there was a man who was a member of the congregation. There I was at Mount Vernon in Prescott, Arizona, and can't even think of Henry's last name now. It's been so long. Henry Thurman. And Henry was a member of the church because he'd been converted back in his days living in Indiana. He'd been converted by what I called him at the time was one of the local Campbellite preachers rented the apartment over my garage. You know, he moved into town. He didn't have a place to live. He rented the over the garage apartment at my house. And he said, and Henry was a Baptist, hardcore. And Henry wanted to talk to that Campbellite preacher, all right? Because obviously he thought he was wrong. And here's what the young man said. I don't guess Henry ever even told me his name. Maybe he did. If he did, I forgot it. He said, here's what the young man told me. He said, Henry, I'll be happy to come down and sit with you and study as long as you want to study. He says, but I'm going to make you this promise. The moment you get angry, I'm done. The moment you get angry, I'm done. And he said, he came down that first time, we sat down and studied, and he started talking about some scriptures. He said, and I got mad. He said, he just folded up his Bible and got up, walked up the stairs. He said, that made me madder. But he kept his word. He said, the minute I got angry, he closed his Bible and he left, just like he promised me he would. He said, that made me even more determined to study my Bible so the next time that, he'd get angry. Well, guess what happened? That guy never got angry. And guess what happened to Henry? Obeyed the gospel. He obeyed the gospel. And so what I'm telling you is just because when you're dealing with somebody you deal with on a regular basis, just because they get angry then doesn't mean it's over forever, but it needs to be over right then. Because nothing productive is going to happen from that point forward. All right? And so listen carefully. Number 2, within this artful method, think critically. Critically. Now, we think about criticism in a negative way, right? But to be critical in its purest sense just simply means to be what? Thorough. In other words, to get to the heart of a matter. In other words, weigh everything in the balances. All right? Critical thinking is not negative thinking. It's thinking that takes things and puts them in an orderly manner. All right? Learn to think critically. Hebrews 5:12-14. You have need that somebody feed you milk and not strong food. He says, because milk belongs to children and strong food belongs to those who have exercised themselves to know good and evil. Strong food is for people who have the ability to practice discernment, to choose what is right and what is wrong, or to choose what is better over what is good, discernment. And so we want to learn to think critically, use discernment, all right? Then here's the third one, and it's actually 2 parts. Answer cautiously and considerately. Answer cautiously and considerately. I believe it's Proverbs 15:1 says, a soft answer turns away wrath. A soft answer turns away wrath. Colossians 4, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, so that you might know how you ought to answer every man. And so 1 Peter 3:15, sanctify the Lord God in your heart and be ready to give an answer. That is a defense of the reason of the hope that lies within you with meekness and fear. Meekness is restraint. Fear is reverence, respect. We want to speak to people with restraint and respect. We don't ever want them to think that we are disrespecting them. Okay? All these, as I told some of them up there, look, this is going to take, again, there's no magic pill. There's no magic pill to be an effective soul winner. Just like, there's no magic diet pill. There's no magic smart pill. Those things just don't exist. It's going to take work. And what I'm trying to give you is some of the basic tools to show you where you need to go to work. Now, is it 10 till 11? All right. Well, the clock's right behind you, Thomas. All right. Let me do this. Let me go back, and I know you're probably writing in outline form or whatnot, notes, but I want to do one thing for you real quick. One of the biggest fears that we have in talking to people about biblical matters is that we are afraid that they're going to ask us a question that we don't know. We don't know the answer to. All right? By the way, it happens to all of us. I've been doing this for 30 years. It still happens to me. All right? So those things are going to happen. There's no shame in not knowing the answer to every single question. All right? But let me give you some, I don't want to say shortcuts, but I'm going to give you something that I think will be really helpful to you in these matters, so far as putting a rock in somebody's shoe, okay? Now, there are only about 6 or 7 major doctrines that are going to come up in any discussion of the Bible. All right? Only about 6 or 7, just primary topics. All right? And you don't have to have an exhaustive knowledge of any one of those topics. All you need is one verse to put a rock in somebody's shoe. All right? So I'm gonna list these topics for you. All right? Baptism. That's going to come up at some point. Somebody's going to ask you about baptism. All right? Of all the verses that we might use in regard to baptism, I don't think that there's any better one than Romans 6, 3-5. As I talked in my breakout class, we can use a lot of verses that people believe are suspect, or they have a misunderstanding of the verse itself. Romans 6, 3-5 is just really hard to get around because of the picture that is painted and the timing of the whole thing. Know ye not that as many of us as were baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into his death? Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, like as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. But don't miss verse 5. For if we've been planted together in the likeness of his death, we'll also be in the likeness of his resurrection. You see that conditional statement there? We've left off verse 5 for a long time. Man, verse 5 is powerful. If we've been planted together in the likeness of his death, we'll also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Well, I think we all know what that is, right? We all know what it means to be planted together in the likeness of his death because verse 4 just told us what it was. So there's one. That's the one verse. I call these go-to verses. Go-to verses. You know, when somebody wants to fuss about baptism, say, look, let's look at Romans 6, 3-5. Let's just look through Romans 6, 3-5 and see what Romans 6, 3-5 tells us about baptism. You know, it refutes sprinkling because it says we're buried with him by baptism. And it also says that we're not raised in newness of life until after we are baptized. And it says we won't be in the likeness of his resurrection unless we are first planted in the likeness of his death. And so Romans 6, 3-5 is powerful. It's a great go-to verse on the subject of baptism. Number 2, faith only. Salvation by faith only. Now, to me, look, all my life, James 2:24 has been the go-to verse. You know, and here's the statement. The only time the words faith only are found together in the Bible is James 2:24. And it says that man is justified by works and not by faith only. That's a pretty solid, for lack of a better term, retort. You know, that's a good pebble. That's a good pebble. But as I mentioned also yesterday, you know, you might also use John 3:14-16, because a faith-only advocate is probably going to run right to John 3:16, right? I mean, that's the faith-only passage for everybody, right? John 3:16, the golden text. Well, let's read the 2 verses before it. You know, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man also must be lifted up, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. You know, the serpent was lifted up, but you had to have more than faith in the serpent. You had to get up and go to where the serpent was and look at it if you wanted to be, you know, healed from the snake bite. So it wasn't just a matter of faith in the serpent. You had to respond in faith to that. And Jesus says that his crucifixion is just like that. In other words, Jesus pictures the cross in the serpent. You know, we've all been bitten and we're stung by the serpent of sin, and we have to respond by going to the cross. In other words, there's something that has to be done. It's not just, I believe that there is a cross. As I mentioned in my Bible class, in the breakout class, can you imagine a Jew being bitten by one of those fiery serpents and someone says, hey man, Moses has erected a brass serpent on the other side of the camp. And if you'll go over there, and he's given word, if you'll go over and you'll look at that brass serpent, you'll be healed from your snake bite. Can you imagine any Jew saying, nah, I'd rather be saved by grace and not by works? I don't have to, I believe there's a serpent over there, and believing in that serpent ought to be good enough. And then what's his next words? Mama, it's getting dark, because that guy's going to die, right? I mean, if he don't go with the brass, he's going to die. Well, Jesus pictures that's the context of John 3:16. All right, so John 3, let them use their verse. Let them use John 3:16 and just show them verses 14 and 15. All right, how about miracles? A lot of people still today believe in the miraculous. My go-to verse on miracles is Acts 4:16. Acts 4:16. Look, you can go to 1 Corinthians. I mean, you can try to study the 60-something verses in 1 Corinthians 12-14. Good luck with that. But Acts 4:16 is my go-to verse. And the context is that here's a man that's been laid at the temple gate for years and years. He can't walk, and all of a sudden he can walk. And even the people who don't believe in Jesus recognize that this dude is walking who has never walked. And what do they say about that event? That a notable miracle has been performed by these men is evident or manifest to everybody in Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. You see, there are three. You see the 3 marks of a genuine Bible miracle? It's notable. Everybody knows what's happened. Everybody. It's manifest. Everybody saw it. And it's undeniable. It's not the guy on TV, it's not the guy on TV with his eyes squinted shut saying somebody somewhere is, being healed of a toothache. That's not a notable miracle. It's not manifest, and it's certainly deniable. All right? Acts 4, 6, so what would you say when somebody talks about miracles? Say, well, let me ask you a question. How do you define a miracle? What's the criteria because we want to make sure we're talking about the same thing, right? And we want to define it. So, Acts 4:16 talks about a miracle. Does what is what you're talking about meet the criteria of Acts 4:16? 10 Commandments. People want to talk about following the 10 Commandments. 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 9. You can actually go through verse 18, but 2 Corinthians 3, 7 to 9 is my go-to 10 Commandments verse. Because people want to fuss over, are the 10 Commandments still in effect, but the other 603 are not in effect. 2 Corinthians 3 puts it right on the line. The ministry of death written and engraved in stone. All right? How much of the Mosaic Law was written in stone? Just the first 10, right? They didn't tote around 613 thou shalt and thou shalt nots written in stone. Only 10 on 2 tablets, right? And Paul refers to the 10 Commandments as the ministry of death. And then in verse 9 he calls it the ministry of condemnation. I'll tell you a funny story real quick. I know I'm running out of time. I was at PTP. I was coming through the hallway there in the main hotel, fixing to turn there at the for those of you that have been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Right in front of the elevators in the main lobby, and I run right into Glenn Colley. All right, and completely out of the blue, I barely even have time to say hello to Glenn. He goes, "What's your go-to verse on 10 Commandments?" I said, 2 Corinthians 3, 7 to 18. He goes, "Mine too." Off he went. Completely random conversation. I don't even know that I'd even seen Glenn Colley up to that point. Stops him right in front of the elevators. What's your go-to verse on 10 Commandments? 2 Corinthians 3, 7, 18. Mine too. Boom, gone. All right. So I know my verse got to be good if Glenn uses it, right? If it's Glenn's go-to, it's got to be a good go-to. All right. It's a great go-to verse. Apostasy. Once saved, always saved. Look, 2 Peter 2, 20 to 22 is as good as they come. 2 Peter 2, 20 to 22 is as good as they come. If after they have escaped the pollution that is in the world, they are again entangled therein and overcome, the end is worse for them than the beginning, for it's better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than to have known it and to have turned from the holy commandment which was delivered to them. And then the beautiful picture, it's happened to them according to the true proverb, the dog returns to his vomit and the sow that was washed to wallowing in the mire. Did they escape because the once saved, always saved fallback is, well, if they fall back, they what? Never saved to begin with. So that hog was never washed, was it? Now, Peter said it was washed, but John Calvin says otherwise. So 2 Peter 2, 20 to 22. Then denominationalism, the concept of denominationalism. And by the way, I would add this to the once saved, always saved. What are you going to do with Judas Iscariot? Tell me what happened to Judas Iscariot. Was he ever saved? Because he was an apostle. He went and preached the gospel of the kingdom. And he performed miracles, right? I mean, didn't Jesus empower all the apostles to perform miracles? And you're going to tell me that dude was lost? The whole time he was doing that, he was lost? Because he'd never been saved to begin with? Or are you going to tell me that he was saved after he sold out the Lord for 30 pieces of silver and went out and killed himself? It's got to be one of the two, right? I mean, if once saved, always saved, if the argument of once saved, always saved is they never were saved to begin with, then that's the only possibility for Judas Iscariot. Never was saved, or he sold out the Lord for 30 pieces of silver and killed himself and still went to heaven without repenting. Now, who wants to defend that? Certainly not me. Then the idea of denominationalism in John 17, 9 to 21. That one in me, that they may be one in us, as I am in you and you are in me, that they may be one in us, that the world may believe that you have sent me. The oneness principle of religion that is to picture that of the Lord. All right, sorry, I'm over time. Avery, come on, bub. You gonna take, we gotta take a break, that's right.
We can push lunch back too. Keep going.
city. I want a mansion, a Roman of Thank you much. All right, come on in here. Let's filter in. Now, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Proverbs chapter 27. This will serve as our springboard for this morning. Proverbs chapter 27. My topic was risking the friendship to save the soul. It's not that easy of a topic, but it also is in a way. Because, the answer is, yeah, obviously we need to risk the friendship to save the soul. But in today's ever-increasingly sensitive generations, hey, look, I'm not the problem. Y'all are the problem. I'm a millennial. Y'all are Gen Z. Y'all are the sensitive ones. When we're talking about, no, I'm just kidding. No, but as we've seen this world descend into humanism, it gets harder to talk about this topic. Each year it gets harder to talk about this topic because we are so conditioned into letting everybody live their truth and letting everybody find their own path. And, that comes from existentialism. Everybody makes their own existence and you find your own purpose in life. And we are striving, we're going further and further away from God's plan for each and every individual. So it is becoming increasingly harder to talk about, but I think one verse that sums it up really well is in Proverbs. So Proverbs chapter 27, I want you to look at verses 5 and 6 collectively before we start this topic. No matter where we end up in this topic, this is going to be our theme verse. Verse is, in verse number 5, better is an open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Profuse are the kisses of an enemy. That's it. That's the summary of this whole lesson. Of better is the open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Profuse or deceitful, some versions may say, are the kisses of an enemy. Which leads me to our first point, and if you are taking notes, you can write this down if you wish to. Love hurts. Love hurts. How many of us, by show of hands, how many of us have ever been asked relationship advice from a friend at some point? A lot of us have. Or advice on various topics about their, how they're supposed to do their job, or, should they seek another job, or we're asked hard questions by our friends all the time. And if you're honest with your friend, you may have said something along these lines. I love you, but your new boyfriend is trash. Or, I love you, but your new girlfriend is annoying. We might have said something along those lines. Maybe we've been told something along those lines. But hopefully, because you're close enough, you would work through that. Hopefully you would be able to find it in yourself to become friends with them after that hard conversation. But sometimes there are situations in our lives where we have to have these hard conversations with our friends. And in every area except religion, we are completely comfortable having those conversations. A lot of times we go out and try to give people advice when they don't want our advice. They might be looking at our relationship with our boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse and say, I don't want advice from you. It's funny because I've always had a problem with people being consistent and things of that nature. And I'm not going to get off into a rabbit trail here, but one time, I'm not a big guy. I try to stay fit, try to stay healthy. One time, this guy, and man, he was a bigger fella. We were talking about health, and he's just like, well, here's what you need to do. I was like, whoa. I didn't ask for that advice. I'm not trying to be rude, but I didn't ask for that advice. Sometimes we go out of our way to give advice that is unsolicited. But when it comes to areas of religion, we're uncomfortable even talking about it. Oh, well, I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. I don't want to overstep. But at the end of the day, friends don't let friends make bad choices. Right? If we see our friends doing something unhealthy for them, hopefully we'd speak up. If we feel like our friends are being mistreated at their job, we say something. If we feel like our friends are being mistreated in a relationship, we say something. If we feel like our friends are not on the right spiritual path, it's our job to say something. It is our job to say something. Because ultimately what we're really trying to say here is that friends don't let friends go to hell. I mean, that's a little jarring in and of itself, but friends don't let friends go to hell. And the most unloving thing you can do to your friend is to allow them to step into eternity unprepared. And so we're going to get into this. I want you to go with me to the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 2 is where we're going to start. Galatians chapter 2 is where we're going to start this morning. Many people may not even know that this is recorded in their Bibles. But in Galatians 2, we have two apostles. And they kind of have a little face-off, if you will. Paul versus Peter. Now, Paul was a humble man. Paul called himself the least of the apostles. Why was it that Paul called himself the least of the apostles? Well, one of the reasons why Paul called himself the least of the apostles is because he was not there during Jesus' Galilean ministry. He was off doing other things. And so while these other men are with Christ every single day, they're camping out at night, they're talking around a fire, they are in the trenches together day in and day out, Paul's not there. Paul was converted later on. Yet, I want you to see how Paul confronts Peter in Galatians chapter 2. I want you to look at verses 11 through 14 with me. 11 through 14, it says, "But when Cephas, that is Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to the face, because he stood condemned. Before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, that is the Jews, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And he himself," verse number 13, "and the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel," I love that. When it's not in step with the truth of the gospel, "I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force Gentiles to live like Jews?" Now, what does all that text mean? Well, we understand at this point, and it's really, if you think about the life of Peter, this is really unfortunate. In Acts 10, the first Gentile to be converted was converted by who? Peter. He was the one that was told in the book of Acts that do not call what is clean unclean. I am breaking down the barriers. There is no more Jew and Gentile. The gospel is for all. And he was the one who stood up in the house of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 and said, you cannot refuse these men salvation. He was the one who said that, but here in Galatians chapter 2, he had completely flipped the script. See, when the Jews weren't around, Peter would eat with the Gentiles. He was friends with them. Let's say Todd's a Gentile. We go out to eat. We have a good time. But then when somebody who's Jewish comes in, I act like I don't know him. I'm a stranger to you. That's wrong. That is dead wrong. And especially to be coming from Peter. But here is Paul, who considers himself the least of the apostles, a humble man. And he stands up in front of Peter, the Peter, one of the chosen. One that was standing on the Mount of Transfiguration, Peter. Special Peter. And he says, you're in the wrong. You're in the wrong. And he says that at risk of a lot of things. More than just a friendship. Paul says that at risk of his own reputation. He says that at risk of a lot of social backlash. What could have Peter said? Peter could have embarrassed Paul right there. How dare you? Who do you think you are? You know what? I changed my mind. I know that we were supposed to call you an apostle, but just like everybody else in the book of Galatians, I'm going to start calling you a false apostle. That's what Peter could have done. But Paul, because he loved him, because sometimes love hurts, he said, you're in the wrong, Peter. You're in the wrong. And you not only are you in the wrong, everybody that's doing it with you, and now you've led young Barnabas astray. How dare you? Sometimes we have to have difficult conversations. But if we aren't willing to have them with our own friends, who is? If Paul wasn't going to stand up, we can see in this text that he was not in step with the gospel and he had led others astray with him. Let's act as if Paul didn't say a word. Would this problem have gone away? There's no indication in the text. Probably wouldn't have. Based on how everybody else had reacted to Peter, oh, it's not my place. Some may have said. Of course, it's not recorded, but some may have said, oh, that's not my place. Oh, come on, it's Peter. Do you really think Peter's in the wrong? But Paul was willing to stand up and withstand him to the face, have that difficult conversation. Furthermore, stay in the book of Galatians. I want you to go to chapter 4, because not only was Paul willing to do that to Peter, but he was also willing to do it to an entire congregation. In Galatians chapter 4, starting in verse number 15 and going down to about verse number 20, it says, what then has become of your blessedness? Okay, I mentioned just a moment ago that a lot of people in the book of Galatians criticized Paul, and in most of his epistles, he answers a lot of criticism concerning his apostolic authority, and among other things. So in the book of Galatians, what we really see, it's really a wonderful book. We studied it about 1.5 years, 2 years ago with the youth group here, and to date, that was probably my favorite study we've done. It's a wonderful book, and it really gets into how the Galatians had left the truth. They had started accepting things that were not true. They were being led astray by people. And so Paul starts going backwards in verse number 15. He said, what has become of your blessedness? You used to be so solid in your faith. Where did that go? For I testify to you that if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. There was a time, Paul says, that you Galatians, you would have done anything for me, and I would have done anything for you. We were close like that. We were best friends. But now these people, as soon as I walk out of the room, these people come into the church and they say, hey, that guy, he's good and all, but, he's not really that good. We don't disagree with him in these areas, and they started leading this congregation astray. So he said, what happened? How do we lose touch? We might say to our friends, how did we lose touch? There was a time where I would have died for you and you would have died for me. That's how close we were. Verse number 16, have I then become your enemy for telling you the truth? They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out, that you may make much of them. Okay, pause right there before we get to verse 18. I want you to read verse 17 one more time. They, okay, that they is going back to these false teachers. These false teachers want to shut you out, that you make much of them. It makes them feel good to control you, and you're allowing them to control you. That's what verse 17 just said. You are allowing these false teachers to lead you down a path that you know better. And I'm going to become your enemy just because I want to tell you the truth? I'm telling you the truth not because it's fun, not because it's easy, but because I love you. There was a time where we were really close, and what happened to that? That's what Paul's saying. Pick up verse number 18. It is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, for whom I am again, look at Paul's passion. My little children, for whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth, until Christ is formed in you. I wish that I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed by you or about you. That's how deeply Paul cared for his friends. Have you ever hurt so much for a friend that it's made you physically sick? That's what happened to Paul. He cared so much about the souls of the Galatians that he was willing to risk said friendship. He was willing to make things awkward in order to save their souls. He said, I am torn up about this. I don't want to have this conversation. I wish I could be with you and I could change my tone, but I just can't because of the state that you're in. That's how much he cared. But somehow in our society, it becomes to the point where if you disagree with me, we are enemies. If you disagree with me, you must hate me. It doesn't even have to be a personal attack, especially in the realm of politics. We talked about politics a minute ago. Yeah, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson has a lot of great things to say. He's a clinical psychologist. I've read all his books. He's a really smart guy. And a lot of times he's not even talking about politics in the slightest. He's just talking about how to make your life better, how to be a better person, how to converse with people and have these hard conversations. There are some friend groups of mine that if I even mention the name Jordan Peterson and that I read one of his books, I could literally say, yeah, I read Mein Kampf. That's Hitler's book. I read Mein Kampf. Oh, really? Yeah. But if I said, oh, I read Jordan Peterson's book, then you are the worst scum that you could, be. Because we're so hostile. I mean, I'm telling you, there's some people that are just that ready to fight with you. And they are so eager to disagree and to feel hurt. And they're looking to feel hurt. But I want you to understand in the context of what we're talking about today, about risking the friendship to save the soul, it's worth it. I'm sorry, it's worth it. If our friendship is going to be at jeopardy, by me telling you the truth, it's worth it. I mean, because at the end of the day, that's how much I care for you. And the most unloving thing you can do is to allow your friends and your family and everyone you meet, we might add, to step off into eternity unprepared. Let's turn the tables for just a second. I want you to imagine with me, of course, hypotheticals. You've got to be careful about hypotheticals. Your best friend in the world. I've had the same two best friends since 3rd grade, and we are getting older. We've been friends for a long time. I love those boys. We've been through everything. I mean, we grew up together. We are very close. It would be such a tragedy to, again, hypothetically, be standing in line at judgment. Matthew chapter 25 says, the sheep will be divided from the goats. Now, let's say that you're on the sheep side of things, and you look over and you see your two best friends and the goats. That would be hard. That would be really hard. And what would their response be to you? I mean, we've been best friends. Dude, we used to have sleepovers together. We went to school together in college. We roomed together. We were buddies. Why didn't you tell me? We could talk sports for hours, and we could argue with each other about whether or not the Cowboys are an actually good team or if they just got lucky, which they got lucky. But you didn't tell me. Was I not good enough friends with you that you didn't want to be honest with me? What would you say? What would your response be to that friend on the other side? There's really nothing you can say. That's hard. And in fear of that, I have had to ruin a lot of friendships through the years. I mean, I became a preacher when I was young. I started when I was, 20 years old is when I took my first full-time work out of school. Most of my other 20-year-old friends were not being preachers. I'll just say it that way. They were doing other things. I alienated myself from a lot of friends in order to follow the truth. And you will have to make hard decisions as a Christian, especially as we get as a society further and further away from God. But it's worth it, because that's loving. Love hurts. It reminds me, and I didn't intend for us to go to any of these verses, but just go there in your mind. But Paul, one of my favorite texts in the whole Bible is Romans chapter 10. Brethren, my prayer to God, my heart's desire is that Israel be saved, for I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. And he goes on to talk about how we as a society in Rome have no clue who God is. And it's our fault that they don't know who God is. It's one of the best texts on evangelism in our New Testaments. But how he starts that, brethren, my prayer to God and heart's desire is that Israel be saved. That's all I want. Will they be saved? Probably not. That's all I want. I want you to consider also, not only does love hurt and we don't let friends make poor choices. Friends don't let friends make bad choices. But I want you to also consider the cost of silence. What's the alternative? Okay, so we've talked about, we should speak up. It's the right thing to do. It's the loving thing to do. That's great. Let's say we don't speak up. What's the result? I want you to go with me in your Old Testaments to Ezekiel chapter 3. Ezekiel chapter 3. This is the cost of silence. Ezekiel is a book that, typically in a traditional Bible class, we really don't get around to it much. But I would suggest that you really study up on this book because it will benefit your faith greatly. So Ezekiel was told to go and speak to the people on behalf of God. And it's funny because when God called Ezekiel to do his job, he told Ezekiel, now you're going to go and you're going to speak to the people, and guess what? They're not going to listen to you. That's what God told Ezekiel before he starts his ministry. You're going to go, you're going to preach your heart out, you're going to cry at night, you're going to labor with these people, and they are not going to listen to you. So that's real encouraging to start out with. But in response to maybe some of Ezekiel's hesitations, here's what God says in chapter 3. I want you to start with me in verse number 17. It says, Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, you shall give them warning from me. Verse number 18. If I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from the wickedness of his way, in order to save his life, that wicked person shall die for his iniquity. Watch the end of the verse. But his blood I will require at your hand. That's chilling. Verse number 19, because we're going to go all the way down to verse number 21. But if you warn the wicked, and he does not turn from the wickedness of his way, he shall die for his iniquity, but you will have delivered your soul. Again, if a righteous person turns from his righteousness, we just talked a moment ago about once saved, always saved. Here's the answer to that. Here's an Old Testament answer to that in verse number 20. Again, if a righteous person, someone who knows better, turns from his righteousness and commits injustice, and I lay a stumbling block before him, he shall die because you have not warned him. He shall die for his sins, and his righteous deeds that he has done shall not be remembered, but his blood I will require at your hands. But if you warn the righteous person not to sin, and he does not sin, he shall surely live, because he took warning, and you will have delivered your soul. This text is awesome. This is an awesome text about reaching the lost. Now, Ezekiel, we already know that Ezekiel was told that you need to go and speak to these people, and they're not going to listen to you, but speak anyway. If anybody has a shot with your friend group, it's you. Okay? I know my friends. I've spent time with my friends. They may or they may not listen to me, but I know I'm in the best position to make an effort. Your friend group, you're the best person to bring that news to them. But I tell you, the cost of silence is not only losing that friend, it's losing yourself. We gave the hypothetical a minute ago, remember? We have the goats and the sheep. And we said, we're going to be on the sheep side and we're going to be looking over to the goat side. That's not what Ezekiel said. That's not what that book just said. He said, you'll be on the goat side. The cost of silence is not only the soul of your friend, but it's your soul. We are told to be watchmen. Israel was called to be watchmen. We're the New Testament watchmen. We are told to impart the wisdom of God to the world. You may be, and you probably heard it said, you may be the only Bible someone ever reads. Don't let it stay shut. Because if you let it stay shut, at the cost of what? Feelings? At the cost of being best buddies with somebody and not getting invited to their birthday party? Is that what's worth shutting the Word of God for? I mean, really, guys. Think about it. There is nothing in this world more valuable than your soul. Yes? Well, it's surely not a friendship. And Ezekiel and all these prophets, man, all these prophets, they went to their own and they were persecuted. Part of the reason why we don't see a lot of persecution nowadays, people just don't talk about the gospel. I mean, it's real easy, and I said this a couple weeks ago in a lesson. It's super easy to get along with everybody, if you think about it. All I need to do to get along with everybody in the world is find out what you believe, what you like, what you don't like, and just say, oh yeah, me too. That's a real easy way to do it. Oh, I believe, you can spit out some radical idea. And if I just say, me too, then we're best friends. At what cost? At the cost of the truth. And all these Old Testament prophets, man, if you go through each story, it is amazing the opposition they had to overcome for the sake of the truth. In Jewish history, they say that Amos, and this is not recorded, but they say that Amos was clubbed to death in his own hometown for preaching the truth. The book of John says that Jesus went to his own, and his own received him not. Paul wrote to the Galatians, as we just read a moment ago, you used to be best buddies with me. You would gouge your eyes out for me. And now we're enemies now? But it's always worth it. It is always worth it. Because if you think about the cost of silence, the alternative is, sure, I get to stay friends with you, but I'm going to lose my soul and you're going to lose your soul. And that's not worth a friendship. Like I said, I've had the best friend in the world. My best buddy, a lot of people who know me well know my best friend's name is Jared. We've been best friends since 3rd grade. Our friendship's not worth a soul. It's not. And everything in Scripture tells us that. And you must be willing, because you are bound to do this through love, you must be willing to put that friendship at risk, because the cost of silence is way more than you want to pay. But a lot of times we don't think about that cost of silence. I want you to also go with me to Matthew chapter 15 in your New Testaments. Matthew chapter 15. I want you to consider starting in verse number 12 and going down through about verse number 14. Matthew chapter 15, verses 12 through 14. The disciples came to Jesus, we might add. The disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees, were offended when they heard this saying? So when Christ was out there speaking and preaching and teaching, he offended people. Do you think Jesus was trying to be controversial? Do you think Jesus didn't care about these people? I mean, Jesus cared enough to be hanging on a cross and say, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. That's how much he cared. There is no one who empathizes and sympathizes with people like Christ did. But it says in this text that when they were offended, that's what the disciples came running to report to Jesus. Watch the response in verse number 13. And he answered, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone, they are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, they will both fall into the pit. Jesus wasn't here to be controversial. Jesus wasn't here to upset people. But if it's what they needed to hear, that's what he was going to say. Don't you know that you're offending these scribes and Pharisees by what you're teaching? Response, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted shall be rooted up and destroyed. I'd rather tell you right now, while you still have a chance, that you aren't growing right, than to see you plucked up and thrown into the fire pit. That's Christ's response. The most unloving, and I know it's sounding repetitive at this point, the most unloving thing you can do is remain silent. The most hateful thing you can do is to allow people to step off into eternity at risk of a friendship. What kind of friend is that? Jesus said, I'm not going to be that guy. If they're offended at what I have to say, I'm sorry, but get over it. He was going to teach the truth regardless. Think back, there's a million examples. That's why this text is so awesome to speak on. Appreciate this topic. Acts chapter 17. What was Paul doing in Acts 17? He was at a place called Mars Hill in Athens. He was willing to stand up, not just around a few people. He was willing to stand up in the middle of a city and point to their temple and say, hey, that's not right. You see that inscription that says, to the unknown God? You guys don't even know what God you're serving. Do you think that was offensive? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was pretty offensive. In the same book of Acts, when Paul was standing before Felix, and Felix says basically, hey, I can get you out of this situation. I want to talk to you, though, for a little bit about your faith. He said the same thing to Agrippa, too. Agrippa and Felix both, in two separate chapters, two separate occasions, questioned Paul about his faith. And when he talked to Felix, the text says that he reasoned with him about righteousness and the judgment to come. Paul could have said the right words and been released by Felix, free to go along his way, because after all, he was a Roman citizen. But he wasn't willing to sacrifice that for the truth. The truth is going to always bother some people. One of my favorite ministers, someone who I viewed as a mentor, was a preacher by the name of Michael Shepherd. And many of you know Michael Shepherd. Jordan knows exactly what I'm talking about because we talked about it a lot in school. Michael Shepherd said the truth is always going to bother people living in sin and in error. The question is are you willing to sacrifice said truth and allow them to live in sin and error? Christ wasn't. Paul wasn't. Back in the Old Testament, Daniel wasn't. As a child, we read these stories about these heroic characters in the Old Testament. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They stood up in front of Nebuchadnezzar and they weren't willing to bow down. Daniel was told not to pray and he prayed anyway and thrown into the lion's den. Where did our commitment to truth go? So yes, I know we're talking about friendships and evangelism, but just in general, where did our commitment to God go? As a society, as a nation, we trade God for anything. Today it may be a friendship. Tomorrow it's a job. Next week it's something else. We are just looking to trade God and His truth for anything. Friends, the real root of this topic is how committed are you to God? That's really the root of this topic. Seek ye first. If you don't hate your father and mother, that's what Christ said. If you don't hate your father and mother and put me first, then you can't be my follower. So yes, today we're talking about friends and risking a friendship. But we have to forsake all for God. We have to forsake everything for Him. And every one of our great Bible stories that we have held so dear to our hearts since we were children indicates that. But as we look around, we are so willing to risk to risk truth for anything, not just friendships. And it's sad. In the last place, and I know we're probably getting close to time too, but I'm on the last point. Risk versus reward. Okay, so we talked about the cost of silence. We talked about the fact that sometimes love hurts, and the truth is needed regardless of how much you love someone, and it's because you love someone that you are willing to give them that truth. But I want you to think now about risk versus reward. The first place I want to go to is James chapter 5. So James chapter 5, we'll read a couple verses here and then we'll go over to the Old Testament for just a bit. James chapter 5, starting in verse number 19. The alternative to silence and that cost of silence is this. Start in verse number 19. My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering, will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. Okay, so silence leads to a lot of best friends, right? A lot of people that I can just be on the surface with and just state that I agree with everything you believe. I'll be real popular. That's what silence leads to. But when you speak up, oftentimes it leads to this. the bringing home of the lost, the saving of a soul, eternal life. You know, I think there's enough time in eternity for your friend to thank you for upsetting them now. You know? I think there's enough time in eternity and enough enjoyment of eternity that they will look over it and say, I'm so glad you upset me when I was on earth for that little speck of time in all of human history. Thank you for telling me that. I don't think anybody would stand on the good side of eternity and say otherwise. So you might hate me now, thank me later. That was Paul's philosophy, that was Christ's philosophy, that was Daniel's philosophy, that was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's philosophy, that was Ezekiel's philosophy, that was everyone's philosophy. Don't lose sight of that, because the alternative, as we've already looked at, is not good. Now I want you to go to 2 Samuel chapter 12, and I'll give you a second to turn there. And 2 Samuel chapter 12, another great example of risking a friendship, and in this case, a lot more than just a friendship, to save the soul. 2 Samuel chapter 12, and starting in verse number 1, and we're going to read a good chunk of this because it's a good story altogether. So we're going to go 1 through 9, and then we'll look at verse number 13 at the very end. But I want to give you a little bit of context for this passage. This is David. David had sinned with Bathsheba at this point. Okay, so David has conspired to kill Uriah. Uriah is now dead, and David is just doing fine. He's just doing dandy. He got through, no strings attached. He's got the girl, the problem guy's out of the way, and everything's fine in the life of David, seemingly. But I want you to see what Nathan has to do. And starting in verse number 1, the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said, there were two men in a certain city. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one ewe lamb. I've actually heard somebody read this before and say, one ewe lamb. It's not ewe. One ewe lamb, just that pitiful guy. No, verse number 3. The poor man had nothing but one ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink of his cup and lie in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now there was a certain traveler who came to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take of one of his flock. Remember, verse 2 said he had a lot of stuff, but he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Watch David's response, verse 5. David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. That's what King David said. He needs to die. Continue with me. Verse number 6. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he had done this thing and because he had no pity. Here's where we come into the text. In verse number 7, Nathan says to David, yeah, I agree. You're the man. You're the one I'm talking about. How hard do you think that conversation was for Nathan? That's pretty hard. That's pretty tough. I mean, he really went out of his way to rile David up and then drop the biggest bomb of all. You're the one. You're the problem. I mean, surely we wouldn't even go to our friends and say it in that way. We would have some kind of nice text. We'd, read over and read over and read over. Hey, I think you're not doing things right, or whatever you want to say. No, Nathan just kicks the door in and goes, nope, it's you, and then walks out. That's how committed to truth Nathan was. And at this point, again, in David's life, he had gotten out of this situation with no problems. He's the king. He can do whatever he wants. And Uriah's dead. He's got Bathsheba. He's good to go. But when Nathan brings it to his attention, I want you to drop down to verse number 13. After a little bit of dialogue, it says, David said to Nathan, I have sinned. I've sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sins, and you shall not die. That's what that text led to. That's what that hard conversation led to. When you think about the reward of not remaining silent, I should say. When you think about the reward of those hard conversations, it's verse 13. David was saved, thanks to Nathan. Thanks to that hard conversation where he had to upset and turn David's life upside down. But it led to salvation. And that is so wonderful. The relief you can have when you are with your friend or family member or co-worker or whoever you want to put into this scenario, the relief you can have knowing that I did try my best and they responded. I'm not saying that everybody will respond. You know, the book of Luke says there's 4 soils out there, 3 of them are bad. We're not going to get them all. But that's going to stop us from trying? Surely not. Surely not. The reward is salvation. Also, one more text and then the lesson will be yours. I want you to go to Matthew chapter 10. To sum it all up, Matthew chapter 10. And I want you to start in verse number 32 with me. And we'll look at verse 33 as well. So Christ speaking here says, "So everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven." Part of the reward, as was previously stated, in being willing to upset people, not purposely upsetting people, I never said purposely, being willing to have these hard conversations, it leads to our deliverance. As we looked at in Ezekiel, we are part of this narrative. We are part of this story. The blood will be required at our hands if we say nothing. But if you speak, if you blow the trumpet and tell everybody, hey, God's coming back, prepare, and they don't budge, then you will have delivered your soul, is what Ezekiel said. And Christ reiterated that in Matthew chapter 10. If you're willing to proclaim my name in front of the world, I'll proclaim your name in front of God. But if you don't, I never knew you. If you didn't know me in front of your friends, why am I supposed to know you in front of mine? That's what Christ has to say. So as we go back and review, yes, love hurts. Sometimes we have to have difficult conversations with people. It's part of life. You're not going to get through life and never have a difficult conversation, as much as you want to, about something. Might as well be about God. The cost of silence is not only the soul of your friend, but it's your soul. But the reward of speaking up is their salvation and your salvation. I know it's tough. Man, I've been there and I continue to be there with a lot of people in my life. But it's worth it. Don't let people go into eternity unprepared. Thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate you being here. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Eli.
That last point is really good friends. We've been friends for a while and they were lost. And some of those friends are here sitting today with us worshiping. And, Christ gave us the opportunity to take a friend and make him into a brother. And that's like, I thought we were close friends before, But like now, the risk is like just overshadowed completely by the rejoicing and the reward of that. So thank you, Avery. That is a heavy topic. That was really good stuff. Now we got some lunch upstairs, and before we go, Colton's going to go ahead and pray for that meal. So let's stand for the prayer.
Let's pray. Our most high and mighty God, we thank you, Father, for being able to be here, to be able to learn from your word, Father, to be able to be here together. We're thankful for one another, Father. We're thankful for all the many blessings that you provide to us continually, how you take care of us, Father, and how you love us. We ask you, Father, to please bless the food which we're about to eat, to the strength and nourishment of our bodies. Help us, Father, to grow closer together. It's in your Son's loving name we pray, King Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
So, first John. So then I
Oh, no.
What is it?
because what
all good, right?
No, we don't have to.
Here we are.
You can like request like the 15 verse 15 teams when you Max's first time. Actually, according to the truth, you're not walking in the light right now. That's true. You're not walking in the light right now. That's what I have.
You've got tax.
You know, like I heard that like phrases.
At the end of the chapter,
I was like, oh, that'd be like a really great song.
I don't
And I was like,
I don't frustrate the racism.
hello, how are you?
I'm not frustrated.
Did you watch Phineas and Ferb? Have you watched Phineas and Ferb yet?
Forgot.
No?
Forgot that I sacrificed.
We'll work on it. That's all right. How are you doing? Good. It's good to see you. What does your shirt say? Always bring your sunshine.
Oh, of course.
What are the glitter things? Oh, okay. So it changes colors. That's good. It's very nice. It's very nice. Oh, always bring your own sunshine. You bring your own sunshine today?
Jesse can take him to the bathroom.
I got my message.
I've actually been on this.
Oh yeah. Oh no. We'd be out. I'd be with like at least like
We were waiting. We just love, and then all of it will fall into place. We're so preoccupied with making sure everybody's doing the right thing. We're not going to.
I appreciate that. So that's like a. Not gonna. Something I would say to you about
You're like, oh, it could be.
You're so worried about telling everyone how to come down.
That you're not jumping.
You're not telling them. You're not jumping. You're not telling them. It's like there's no.
I wouldn't even say it's an hour and a half, but that was because last year, like, we had like 50 minutes, and the girls came out, found me, like, he's doing 50 minutes, we need 3 hours. So I'm gonna, like, say beforehand, like, that's the upper. It can be a minute, it can be 30 seconds.
Yeah. It's not.
I did too. That's
Yeah.
Right. It's not.
Yeah, no, it's not, you don't even have to, like, it's just like one experience, because what I want everybody to see is, like, evangelism is not like a one-size-fits-all. It's like, it looks different. So, like, yours is going to look different. I mean, that's right. And Christian is going to look completely different. And I don't know if that's just what you're trying to do, but I try to get, like, just one of those wide range of personalities and experiences. Just so you guys are, like, just, like, it's like, well, like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's like, so,
I want to love you, so I have to.
good to see you.
Well, I mean more like
It's over by word.
But if I go through something wrong, whatever.
yes.
I have faith that you're going to respond. But if I take here, whatever, just point it out. That point out, here's a person, that's that person, whatever. It's like,
We give the first so hey, you're not supposed to be able to
like I also for some things I would agree. Here's 5 reasons why you should do this. Yeah.
So you've got to look.
I correct him.
Right.
Whereas
I stood for the truth.
or if Eli comes to me and says, hey,
Yeah, that's my point.
then what I would do is say, I'll pray.
Yeah.
Like, I
should anyway, if I love that. That's all I'm saying.
Well, because and that's where, but it all goes back to, you know, if you're looking like it. So it all goes back to, did I
That's the
take
root.
that?
That's the
It's the root.
Yeah, it goes back to that.
Like, growth frustration is the difference between like me looking at Jared in his garden and I see like, you know, like I see plant an apple tree and he's got they're between me like showing up with like a shovel and like a rake and cleaning the house and showing up with like a bag of apples and a roll of scotch tape. I'm like, oh, he's got this pine tree. Hey man, you're not supposed to do that. Here's this apple. Let me take the fruit.
We're gonna focus on the first
Right,
part.
yeah. The tree is wrong, but we're going to put the right fruit on it versus how about we plant the right tree?
Yeah, let's just.
Let me throw something in there for like the kind of thing about like you know, even though you're going to evangelize, we're going to have Matthew 27 that tells us that every area God is dispersed. He knows who's going to work here. Who's going to that makes it hard. This is understanding this far now because we don't know, right? We don't know who's going to obey who's not.
Try to take his place.
He put Jared in your life because he knew that Jared was going to obey. Right? You were the light to Jared. Right? You're going to use other people.
Which fits exactly what you mentioned. 5, the end of the chapter. If any of you stop from the truth, then one converts him to start with. You can see from not walking in the truth. So that's the result of it. So coming to you, let's just walk in the light. If we begin to walk in the light, be rooted back up, that's a multitude of sins. Which goes to the grace of the third power.
Talk about it.
In that bright land where we'll never grow of me.